If you've looked at United States politics at any time in the last few decades, you've likely heard the phrase that the United States is a nation of immigrants. This phrase has been echoed by both Democrats and Republicans for quite some time, and is most often used in the context of defending mass immigration into the United States. The phrase has its origins in the late 1950s, where it was heavily promoted by the Anti-Defamation League, an international NGO. Ultimately, a book titled A Nation of Immigrants was sponsored by this organization and released by John F. Kennedy in 1958. And today, one doesn't have to look far to see the mantra being repeated.
We in America are immigrants.
We are a nation of immigrants.
We are a nation of immigrants.
The United States is a nation of immigrants.
America is a nation of immigrants.
We are a nation of immigrants.
I think you see what I mean. But there is a problem with this mantra. It simply isn't true. And it certainly isn't true in the way its proponents want it to be, to justify any and all immigration. To understand why this is, one needs to engage in a thorough review of American history. So without further ado, let's get to the facts that you need to know. Things begin in the colonial period. Most of the first successful settlers that arrived in the land that would become the United States arrived in the early 1600s. These included English, French, Scottish, Spanish, Dutch, and Scandinavian colonists, among others. What all of these colonists had in common was that they were arriving to a land that had very little infrastructure. It was an incredibly dangerous and risky environment. At the time, it took almost 2 months just to cross the Atlantic. And partly because of this, food was an extremely scarce resource. One bad harvest could devastate a community. To give you an idea of the type of threat this posed, after just 2 bad winters, the population of the colony of Jamestown dropped from 500 to 60. While some settlers did encounter Native American communities, this often caused more trouble than it was worth, as it was typically a coin toss if this would result in a friendly encounter or a battle. So, here's what should be underlined about this time period. Firstly, the settlers were not arriving to a well-established country. They were arriving to what was largely wilderness, and they faced threats of famine, weather, and Native American attacks. Secondly, the majority of these settlers were coming from Europe. The English, French, and Spanish would go on to dominate the Americas. Those coming to colonial America who were not from Europe were for the most part slaves brought from Africa. However, it's important to point out the scale. Slaves comprised less than 5% of the 13 colonies' population until the year 1690, almost 80 years after the first colony was established. And finally, it took months making a dangerous journey across the Atlantic for anyone coming to the Americas to even have hope of settling. It's often argued that the United States government had more hands-off immigration policy in its early decades. But there's 2 issues with this. The first is that immigration was still largely controlled by the states, and the second and more important is this brutal journey. Until the mid-1800s, a ship crossing the Atlantic could only carry about 500 passengers on an extremely crowded ship. Many of the passengers wouldn't survive that kind of journey due to disease and other problems. The technology that would allow for true mass migration did not yet exist, and would not exist until the turn of the 20th century, which we'll get to in a little bit. Even into the 1850s, there were thousands of immigrants dying in the Atlantic Ocean trying to get to the United States. The fact that there was a relatively low number of new arrivals coming to the young U.S., combined with the fact that those who did come had to be incredibly competent to make the journey, is why the U.S. had laxer immigration laws in its first few decades. What's perhaps even more important to understand is that the early US had strict naturalization laws. Naturalization allowed someone to vote and become a citizen. Thus, those without naturalization had next to no political power. The Naturalization Act of 1790 restricted this naturalization to only free white people of good character who had been in the US for 2 years. In 1795, that requirement was up to 5 years. The act also required those being naturalized to renounce all allegiance to any foreign power or state. This law remained largely unchanged until 1870, when aliens of African descent were also given access to naturalization. This means that for the first 100 years of US history, immigrants were unable to become citizens or vote unless they were vetted Europeans who had lived in the country for 5 years. Does that sound like a nation of immigrants to you? Now some may be thinking, okay, in the first 100 years of United States history, maybe it wasn't really a nation of immigrants. But surely by the turn of the 20th century, when passenger ships could bring thousands of people at a time to the US, that's when it became a nation of immigrants. After all, the Statue of Liberty was built in 1886, and the 1880s to 1910s saw huge spikes of immigration never seen before in United States history. This is when many people's ancestors, including some of mine, came to the United States. However, that all being said, the idea that this immigration made the United States a nation of immigrants comparable to the modern context is still inaccurate. Let's get into why. First of all, let's talk about the Statue of Liberty. Contrary to what some think, the Statue of Liberty was not put in place to be a symbol of the United States welcoming immigrants. The statue was, in fact, a gift to the United States from France in order to celebrate 100 years of American independence, as well as to commemorate the abolition of slavery. Keen observers may have known this from the broken shackles that can be seen near the statue's feet. Being unveiled in 1886, the statue came at the same time the US was passing some of the most restrictive immigration laws in its history. Indeed, the poem that's regularly cited to connect the statue to immigration was not added until nearly 20 years later. Ultimately, immigration advocates citing the statue do it for sentimental purposes, not factual ones. It's a similar situation with the phrase E pluribus unum. This motto is referring to uniting the 13 colonies to declare independence. It had nothing whatsoever to do with immigration. Returning to the main timeline, immigration into the US did indeed rise greatly at the turn of the 20th century, but it's not as if Congress simply stood by while this happened. To respond to these increases, they passed a variety of immigration restrictions. These included the Immigration Acts of 1882, 1907, and 1917. One highlight of the acts was creating new categories of immigrants who were completely inadmissible to the United States, such as, quote, any convict, lunatic, idiot, or person unable to take care of him or herself without becoming a public charge. The act ordered that these categories not even be allowed to enter U.S. land. These regulations were typically enforced at port through the judgment of immigration officers. The 1907 Act was signed into law by Theodore Roosevelt, who was a firm supporter of assimilating new immigrants into American culture. He wrote, any man who says he is an American but something else also isn't an American at all. We have room for but one flag, the American flag. We have room for but one language, and that is the English language. And we have room for but one sole loyalty, and that is a loyalty to the American people. Roosevelt also stated his intention on preventing the United States from becoming a nation brought to ruins by a tangle of squabbling nationalities. And when we look at our country today, we see what he was referring to. As a side note, many modern progressives think that because Teddy Roosevelt called himself a progressive, that they must have similar political opinions. However, clearly that is not true. Moving on, though, it's also important to note that during this time, as it was through all of US history to this point, almost all of the new immigrants were arriving from Europe. This time, the majority were coming from Southern and Eastern Europe, though Northern and Western Europe, as well as Canada, continued to make up a sizable portion. The Chinese Exclusion Act had also been passed in 1882, and it banned effectively all East Asian immigration. So, what are the main takeaways from this time period? The first is that, although the US was indeed allowing in new immigrants, it was only accepting them from specific parts of the world, mainly Europe. Secondly, it required that strict competency, financial, and moral standards be met by these new immigrants. Any suggestion that the United States just allowed anyone into the country during this time is the opposite of reality. Furthermore, and this is important, the US population was growing mostly from native births, not from new immigrants. In 1910, American women had a fertility rate of 3.4. To put that into perspective, The modern U.S. fertility rate is 1.8, the lowest in its recorded history. As if everything so far wasn't bad enough for the Nation of Immigrants narrative, things get even worse for it in the 1920s. In 1924, Congress completely overhauled immigration. It established a quota system that would put hard caps on immigration and allow in new ones based on the demographics of the 1890 census. The main effect of this was that immigrants from Western Europe received the largest portion of the visas. What Congress had decided was to set a clear demographic path for the United States and its future. The U.S. Office of the Historian puts it thus: in all of its parts, the most basic purpose of the 1924 Immigration Act was to preserve the ideal of U.S. homogeneity. To Congress in the 1920s, it was common sense that genetic and cultural ties between people were the bedrock of prosperous nations. That sense is seemingly lost on many politicians and voters today. The quota system was ultimately very successful. Through both the 1930s and 40s, immigration stayed very low compared to previously. This low level made assimilation very easy.
They learned American literature, the American language, American history, American heroes. It is far more easy to assimilate if you had 1 million Englishmen coming into Virginia than if you had 1 million folks, 1 million Zulu from my friend Chief Butalese's tribe.
By the 1950s, the U.S. Census showed that the demographics of the country were still very similar to what they were in the 1920s. The census found that the U.S. population was 87% non-Hispanic white, 10% black, while every other racial group made up just 3%. The country was also over 90% Christian, with 95% of those saying that religion was important in their lives. This highlights that for the previous 100 years, the immigrants had also been nearly entirely Christian. The 1952 McCarran-Walter Act continued the quota system. During this time, Congress was very concerned about communist subversion of the United States. Pat McCarran, the U.S. Senator from Nevada who helped create the act, argued thus in continuing the quota system. Today, as never before, untold millions are storming our gates for admission, and those gates are cracking under the strain. The solutions of the problems of Europe and Asia will not come through a transplanting of those problems en masse to the United States. If the enemies of this legislation succeed in riddling it to pieces or in amending it beyond recognition, they will have contributed more to promote this nation's downfall than any other group since we have achieved our independence as a nation. It's not hard to see why McCarran and the majority of Congress saw things this way. Throughout the 40s and 50s, U.S. state secrets were rampantly being stolen by espionage rings, and many of those spies were either immigrants or children of immigrants. One of the most infamous examples was the case of Julius and Ethel Rosenberg. The couple, as well as a ring of other immigrant-connected spies, were convicted in 1951 of providing classified information to the Soviet Union. Some of this stolen information involved the Manhattan Project, and its acquisition by the Soviets allowed them to complete their atomic weapon years ahead of schedule. For their part in the plot, the Rosenbergs were executed by electric chair in 1953. The other conspirators all received lengthy prison sentences. This case of espionage was one of many that increased U.S. government scrutiny of foreigners for the rest of the 1950s. So, as the 1960s approached, the United States was still not a nation of immigrants in any meaningful way. Quotas had upheld the European and Christian character of the country, and even among those European immigrants, preference was given to the founding Western European stock. Native births had continued to drive the country's population increase, not immigration. The baby boom stands out as an example of this. So you may be thinking, wait a minute, how did the United States go from having strict quotas, mostly European Christian immigrants, and a Congress skeptical of foreigners, to the modern-day immigration system? In the modern-day immigration system, not only are there not quotas, but about 1 million immigrants enter the United States every single year from all over the world. The answer to this is the 1965 Immigration Act, or the Hart-Celler Act, signed into law by Lyndon B. Johnson. Now, covering this act really deserves its own video, but in summary, it established a new immigration system primarily based on family ties and employment preferences. It abolished all national origin qualifications to immigrate. That meant that the quota system was no more. One of its other most lasting effects was allowing new immigrants to sponsor their family members to also enter the country. This phenomenon is now called chain migration. At the time of its passage, the act was viewed as an extension of the Civil Rights Act, and even its proponents did not seem to expect it to change the United States demographics extremely. However, it did. In the 30 years following the act's passage, the number of legal immigrants entering the country more than tripled from the immigrants entering the previous 30 years. This does not even take into account countless illegal immigrants. But in any case, since 1965, no longer are Europeans the main source of U.S. immigrants. In fact, European countries are now towards the bottom of the list. In their place are countries like Mexico, China, India, and the Philippines. Mexico has been the largest source of immigration nearly every year since 1965, only being surpassed by India in 2017. This wild transformation was in part driven by economic factors. By the 1950s, the US and Europe had some of the highest standards of living in the entire world. Because of this, many Europeans no longer felt the need to immigrate to the United States. At the same time, the economic gap between the Western world and the Third World continued to increase. This caused many to scramble to take advantage of the US's new lax immigration policy. And to be clear, neither of these trends has changed in the last 60 years. Truthfully, the only similarity between immigrants before 1965 and immigrants now is that they're immigrants. The circumstances have entirely changed. A new immigrant to the United States in 2020 is offered welfare programs, public benefits, and a standard of living that immigrants arriving in the 1800s and early 1900s could only dream of. On top of this, new immigrants today are allowed to keep their citizenship to other countries. This has created some conflicts of interest, to say the least. When the historical record is taken in full, the United States is not a nation of immigrants. What the United States is a nation of settlers, of pioneers, of builders, and most importantly, of the American people. A unique people descended from their old world ancestors and developed through the trials and tribulations of building a new nation. And though the country has changed dramatically in the last 60 years of mass immigration, the truth of its roots remain the same. And we should acknowledge and protect these roots, even as forces attempt to change the United States into something unrecognizable from its past self. From a nation of Christians of European ancestry, into a nation in which both groups are declining as a portion of the population, though while our portion decreases, we shall endure, as will our history as long as brave souls are willing to protect it. And when the curtain is pulled back, those who would undermine these truths to peddle an ahistorical, pro-immigration narrative do not have the best interests of the American people or nation at heart. And now, with everything that's been presented to you in this video, you know the facts.